Now, there are sheets passing around, and I know that PERG would love you to have as a supporter and as a participant. And so could you please, if you are not a conscientious, rejecter, put your name down there. All right, now we have a fantastic topic today about global social movements, or rather I would say the global mobilizations of, in particular, 2011. If only we still lived in 2011. What a lot of opportunities would have been there that have by now, to some extent, been lost for a little while and will always come back. Dario and Marina, you are both accomplished and very interesting research on this field. I don't want to simply read down what I have here, so I leave it to you to introduce yourself and say a couple of things about yourself. But let me just say a few words as an introduction about the Annus Mirabilis 2011, just for you as a warming up. 2011 started, well, perhaps even with the Chilean students, and very rapidly moved to North Africa, the Arab Spring, as we know it. Israel, in the course of the year, created a large, what they called middle-class mobilization. The Indignados, Greece, a little bit in Italy, and then of course from September onwards, Occupy Wall Street, which for the first time, I think, for a very long period, put the focus entirely on the stock markets, on Wall Street, and on class, on financialization, which I think as a protest item was entirely new in recent world history. And then it moved on to Romania, Bucharest, Moscow, as you know, early 2012. Then in the course of 2012, strong and continuous mobilizations, not just in Sofia, but also in provincial cities in Bulgaria. I would actually argue that the year 2011 includes the recent enormous mobilization in Ukraine, and the just as recent, but much less well known, except perhaps at CEU and locally, mobilizations in Bosnia. And what it certainly includes, but is regularly left out of the picture, are the 70,000 acts of collective protest in China that are registered officially each year, and is the ongoing Maoist rebellion in the central hinterland, in the forests in India, which probably also engage about a couple of million people ongoing. So if you take that picture of the globe and you would actually use orange or red, or in any case some sort of a hot color to indicate on the map where large-scale mass mobilizations are ongoing. Oh, I'm forgetting actually Istanbul in Turkey, yes. Where mass mobilizations are ongoing, then you indeed see global mobilizations that flicker up, that die out for a little, but that keep burning underground and can be just can shut up very, very rapidly. So this is the situation in a wider political economy framework of mobilization that we're seeing. All right. Now we learn a lot from the press about all sorts of local interpretations of that and the local discourses that are generated by it. The importance, I think, for people like us is to get the right global, local conception of what is going on. Right? So here clearly is a moment in the global development of capitalism that brings out a whole set of contradictions that have been slumbering for a while, creeping, accumulating, and are brought out at once in all their ferocity My hypothesis would certainly be that this is going to continue for quite a while. Right? There are no reasons to see why capitalism and the national instantiations of it that we have can actually solve these contradictions at the moment. They can't represent us, is the title. Then Marina and Dario are going to say, well, he can represent himself in any case. Very good. So I give the word to you. How long are we going to do?
20 minutes each.
About 20 minutes each.
And that they can't represent us, that's based on our having traveled to Greece, Spain, a number of places throughout the world, talking with people in movements, recording testimonies, and then using those for the books. The book is grounded very much in testimony. And then I also generally live in New York. Now I'm in Berlin, and I've lived in Latin America, but I was in New York before Occupy Wall Street, and so was a part of the group that then made Occupy Wall Street, so it's very exciting. So by way of introduction, I'm also a sociologist and a lawyer, and I see myself as kind of having a relationship both in movements and thinking about movements, but generally together with people in movement. So I'm kind of an activist scholar, I guess, maybe is how I would call myself. And then I have a few books on movements in Argentina, and that would be it for now. But I'm going to start, Art, so that we can get into the discussion. Do you want to present yourself before you can? Why don't you present yourself now?
Yeah. Do it now. Yeah, hi. I'm Dario Azzellini, and I actually work at the moment in Linz at the university in Austria, but live in Berlin. And I guess we met and knew each other also because apart from the projects we did together, we both worked on the same subjects and a lot of time in Latin America. Marina more in Argentina and me more in Venezuela, but on very similar issues. And we forgot that two books that she wrote one about the Argentinian movements and I wrote one about the Venezuelan movements, and they have a very similar approach. That's probably how we ended up also collaborating, and not only, but we forgot to bring them, so it's like, yes, and I'm a sociologist and political scientist, and but also have been like most of my life also an activist and writer always, and yeah, I think that's it. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, so what we're going to talk about, the title, as you know, and we're going to focus mainly on experiences in Spain, Greece, and the US because of commonalities in those places. Though we could talk also about Turkey, Brazil, and Bosnia as far as more recent phenomenon that we see as very similar. In the discussion, maybe we can get to the question of the Ukraine or China, which I think there's a different thing happening. Okay, so one of the things that ties them all together and I think can be really useful is even just beginning, thinking in some of the slogans that have come out in the movement since the end of 2010, so really Tunisia and Egypt, but again, there are kind of different questions being raised there. But what came out in all of these movements is first this no, an exclamation of in Tahrir Square in Egypt, they said kifaya, which means enough. In Syntagma Square in Athens, there were banners saying ya basta, which is Spanish for enough, and it's actually, they borrowed it from the Zapatistas, which is something we can talk about in the discussion if you want. It's kind of one of the early markers of this kind of way of organizing. In Turkey, the slogan, one of the main ones, was we've had enough, we're fed up. In Brazil, now nos representan, and in Spanish in Spain, that's no nos representan. In Brazil and Portugal actually was both this, that they don't represent us. In Portugal, they also said, screw the troika, the people must rule. In Russia, and this is one of my favorites, in Moscow, and I can't say it in Russian, I'm sorry, but it's, they can't represent us, and they can't even imagine us. Which then I think leads to the conjuring of the something else, not just the no, but in that no and that enough and that ya basta, there was also the affirmation of the something else. So that's, you can't imagine us. In Spain, it was also democracia real ya, the real democracy now. Or in the US, what then became fairly global is this idea of the 99%. So all of these, he does like to participate. It's something we've learned. When he was little, he would sleep and we would speak. And now he joins in when I talk especially. Okay. So what's happening? We believe that, and without overstating it, that we are really in a new historical epoch, and that based on the content of what's happening, the depth of what's going on, the breadth of it, and the global consistency, and that societies around the world are in movement. And using the word, this is borrowing from Raul Zibecci, a writer from Uruguay who spends a lot of time working together with movements in Latin America. Rather than talking about social movements, talks about societies in movement. And there are very specific reasons for that, and it's some theoretical work that Dario and I have done that actually what falls into general conceptions of social movements and protest movements doesn't actually work to explain what's been happening around the world now. So for now, we can say societies in movement, but it's a whole area that needs to be explored. So what we've been seeing are the millions and millions of people taking to the streets in cities and towns throughout the world, and assembling in plazas, occupying parks, occupying buildings, occupying schools, and then shouting that no, that enough, and in the wake of that no, beginning to create alternatives. We'll talk about all of these things more specifically. One of the things in common that is key is this idea of power over and hierarchy is generally being rejected. With that is representational democracy, which Dario is going to talk about most specifically in the question of democracy, which is being rejected. And that's both ideologically and by default. So that there are some people and in some movements where the idea of you can't represent us comes from not believing in a system of representation and neoliberalism and that form of representation that comes with neoliberalism. But for others, it actually just comes from the experience of, for example, in Athens, having had 5 general strikes against austerity and the government continuing exactly as planned. And this is an experience again and again around the world where people protest whatever is being put forward and are absolutely ignored. So that you don't represent us because you ignore us, is where that's coming from for some people as well. And then what comes out of that is people coming together and organizing in mass assemblies and deciding what to do together. And we see this both as revolutionary, but revolutionary in the sense of day-to-day revolutionary, so rethinking concepts of what revolution means. To talk to a lot of people in a lot of these movements, they will call themselves revolutionaries, though they're not saying we need to go and storm the Bastille or take the state, but they're thinking about and organizing for a different concept of revolution. And these the coming together of these things, the rejection of hierarchy, the horizontal forms of organizing, the scope and the scale of all of it makes it something totally new in all of those things put together, not necessarily each taken individually, and that's why we're arguing it's new. There are a number of things that we're going to touch on that are in common, both with the forms of organization and then even in the language and the forms of language that people use in the different movements. Just as far as basics of in common in organizing, in a lot of places, as was said in the introduction, people who were seen as middle class were some of the early initiators of a lot of these movements. That's not true for the composition later in most places, but as far as the early initiators were a lot of young people, a lot of them college educated, who believe, and rightfully so, that they could have a job perhaps in their field or something remotely close to their field. And that was not the future that they have, which is generally a future of unemployment, a reality of unemployment, or working in the 99 cent stores. So the composition started out very similar in who was there. What was also similar all over is this rejection of political parties. So it's not just a rejection of hierarchy and power over, but a rejection of political parties coming in to represent the movement itself. Also, generally, though there are some exceptions in different ways, but at least in the beginning, not unions either being the representation of what was being manifest in the different plazas and squares around the world. And now as far as forms of organization, and I'm sure when you think of, maybe not, but when you think of the assemblies, I think a lot of people imagine people standing in a circle And there's certain hand gestures that started to spread around the world. This one, when people are doing applause. And it's actually, this is kind of in American Sign Language, this means, this is applause. And this became something that people used in Spain, because when you have thousands of people in an assembly, or even hundreds trying to come to some kind of consensus together, getting a sense of, do people agree, or not so much, or definitely not. This was a way that facilitators could get a sense, and people could get a sense of one another. And it's something that's spread globally, so it is a language. And there are a lot of other hand signals that were used in these processes. Another thing that spread was the people's mic, something that we used in New York because there's so many restrictive laws as far as speech and right to assembly, or lack of right to assembly. So you can't use bullhorns without a permit, or any kind of magnification in New York without a permit. So we ended up replicating one another's voices. And it was also more useful. I was on the facilitation team that first night, and when you have a few thousand people, a megaphone actually doesn't even really work for a conversation. But what we found, and that I think people found again and again, and why they replicated it and continue to replicate it, is the use of the people's mic is, so I say something. Do people know what this is? So the people's mic is when you can't do this to be really loud. I would say, hello, my name is Marina Sitrin. And then the people who can hear me in the closest sphere repeat back, hello, my name is Marina Sitrin. And then the next level, depending how many people you have, it could be there's only one iteration because there's 100 people. But when you have a few hundred people or a few thousand people, you can hear, hello, my name is Marina Sitrin, perhaps 4 times going. So, which is kind of wild when you're the speaker. And really empowering, actually. And I think that is part of why it's used still. But also it encourages a kind of active listening. So rather than often when one person is speaking, other people are taking notes and thinking about what they're going to say next. If you're repeating what you're hearing, you're engaging in a very different way. This wasn't our intention when we started using it in New York, but people imitating it and using it, and then people we've interviewed around the world who've continued to use it, people have found that it facilitates really direct active listening and participation. It raises a lot of challenges and problems in having deep theoretical discussions, which is also something people have found. But this is kind of in the early days one of the common forms that we've seen. In describing the assemblies, a word that actually first emerged in Argentina in Spanish, the word horizontalidad. So it's an area of work that I've done a lot. I've done a lot of work in this because I lived in Argentina after the popular rebellion of 2001, after an economic crisis. And people there, through popular power, going out in the streets, banging pots and pans, forced out a number of governments, 4 governments actually, in a row, also organizing without political parties, without unions. And this is in Argentina now. People found one another, this is how they described it, and started to meet on street corners and organize in assemblies, and not having power over one another, organized in a way that they called horizontalidad. And when I would ask, well, what is horizontalidad? People would say, well, it's this, not this. And this translation of this experience in Argentina, people learning about it, whether actually learning a lot about it or kind of by rumor, which is how a lot of things spread, or you think you know about what happened somewhere. But the language of horizontal has spread, and horizontalism. And so in New York, in Spain, in Greece, actually, they translated the oral history of people in the autonomous movements in Argentina into Greek to try to learn from the experience, but also found really useful this language of horizontal and horizontalism to describe this kind of flat space that we create with one another, creating this active listening and engaging with one another, not having power over each other. And really, what comes out of that form and what so many people talk about is that if you feel, and this is linked to representation, and you'll probably talk about a bit in democracy, how you feel different as a person in that experience. So having felt totally left out of the political system and any decisions in your life, to now being engaged with other people who are listening to you and engaging with you and feeling your experience is actually meaningful. This is what democracy is supposed to be, at least on some small level. So this is the forms in common. So maybe we'll go to democracy now. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. As you notice, we link sometimes to Latin America, quite often actually, and we also have it in this little book, and we talk sometimes about the the protests we've seen since 2011 are some kind of second wave of anti-representational protests, like situating the first wave in Latin America in the 90s from the protests in '89 in Venezuela, the Caracazo, '94 in Mexico, and then around 2000 in Argentina, and then in this around this epoch also in Ecuador, in Bolivia, again in Venezuela, '98, etc. We think that one thing that all these experiences in Latin America and the new cycle of protests have in common is that it's about democracy. Like democracy, but about, like they say in Spain, real democracy. In a sense that there is this widespread experience that the representative democracy, liberal democracy, is not felt democratic by people because they don't see in their daily life where they can take decisions apart from voting for a party every 4 years that anyway will not do what it promised to do during the election campaign. So what is the democracy? What is the campaign? Most people are against the austerity programs and they're done anyway. This feeling that that there is no real participation in representative democracy, I think, is strengthened. Has been strengthened in the last 20 years during the globalization, exactly through the creation of supranational institutions, of different mechanisms where decisions are taken, but where people have no influence, and where even the ones that are taking decisions are not elected. I mean, we have the typical example of the European Union, where we elect the European Parliament, but it's probably the only institution in the European Union not taking real decisions. The decisions are taken then by commissars sent by the governments, but they've never been elected to do what they do, and the governments have never presented, like the parties have never presented who they will send to the European Union to take these decisions in elections or whatever. Other decisions are taken by the G8 or by even now G7, but or even by more informal institutions like the meeting in Davos or the private meeting security conference in Munich every year, or whatever. Like we have all these mechanisms where it appears more and more that we don't have any influence in decision concerning our own lives. And we see that how in the different movements slogans appear, like, well, in Democracia Real Ya in Spain, Real Democracy Now, or one of the slogans that at the beginning was very, very strong was that, like, people were shouting on demonstrations, dicen que es democracia y no es. They say it's democracy, but it isn't. And I think it's not casual that this feeling came up, especially in certain countries where liberal democracy seemed to be a promise at a certain point. I mean, you had the Franco era in Spain, and then democracy was supposed to be a big promise. You had it's like a 10, 15 years of debt finance capitalist dream, and then it's over. Portugal, very similar to that. Or, it's definitely true for the cycle of protests in Latin America as well. And it's probably also true for many others of these demonstration cycles. The question is then if, how this democracy, I think, is, or like representative democracy is an illusion in a sense that it never meant to be democratic. I mean, that the idea that liberal democracy or representative democracy has something to do with democracy is, if we look really at the theory of liberal democracy, it has nothing to do with democracy. It's designed to eliminate participation. It's liberal democracy looks at the outcome, at the output of. It's a way to make decision taking more efficient. And to make it more efficient, you have to eliminate participation. And that's exactly, if we look what the huge theorists, and it's very not casual that they're all men, say about liberal democracy, if we look at Mannheim or at Schumpeter, or without going to the really even very elitist ones like Dahl or others, but if we look at Schumpeter, Schumpeter is very clear. He's so clear that even critics of liberal democracy cannot be clearer. Schumpeter states that people have to understand that once they have elected their representatives to parliament, politics is not their business anymore, but it's the business of the ones they have elected. That's how Schumpeter frames it in Socialism, Capitalism, and Democracy. And he also says that democracy cannot mean by any way the rule of the people, neither rule nor by the people. He is very clear about these things, and so are all the theorists of liberal democracy. Also, the idea that was sold, I mean, especially like in Eastern Europe in the transformation process, but the same thing in Latin America during the 70s and 80s when the dictatorships and authoritarian regimes were slowly turned into representative and liberal democracies, the idea sold was that the liberties we see in different liberal democracies, that they're connected to liberal democracy. But if we look at history, we will know it's not true. It's a lie. I mean, liberal democracy was at the beginning, I mean, first of all, we can look at more than 150 years of terrible fights between liberals and Democrats, because liberalism and democracy had nothing to do with each other. Liberals were absolutely against democracy, while Democrats were absolutely against liberalism. I mean, democracy was something very subversive at the beginning. When does it come together? The moment that liberalism accepts democracy once democracy is limited to the political sphere. So once it's accepted that the economic sphere and the social sphere are not touched by democracy, but only the political sphere as a separate sphere, that's how liberal democracy comes into effect and into being. At the beginning, it's a system where we can see that like rich people have like 5 votes, and poor people don't have any vote, and some have 1 vote, etc. So we cannot really say it's democracy like we think it is. It's also most countries women didn't have the right to vote in liberal democracies until like in some countries 60, 70 years ago, and others 80 or 90 years ago. So we see that all that is sold to us as supposed liberties and advantages of liberal democracies were not inherent part of liberal democracy, but were a result of struggles in liberal democracies. That means that liberal democracy has been, it's not to say that it's totally undemocratic or whatever. It has been during a certain time, it has been a frame in which rights were gained. Because the economic system had the space for reforms. So it could react to the pressure of the people, and rights were broadened in the frame of liberal democracy. The problem is that since the 80s, at least in the countries that had liberal democracy before, the experience is that liberal democracy is not anymore a space to gain rights, but is only a space, has become a space where I'll take it. It'll be easier. Has become a space where we only struggle that the rights that existed before are not taken away. But I cannot remember in liberal democracies in the West that during the last 20 years we gained any rights. I mean, we've been cut, the rights have been cut, and we've been struggling against that. So the question is, and the problem we have today now is that exactly this, the economic system does not have anymore the spaces for reforms that it used to have in the 70s and 80s and in the 60s until the early 80s. So since we don't have these spaces for reforms anymore, it's quite clear that democracy will not be broadened anymore inside a liberal democratic frame. So we have to look for, if we want democracy, we have to look for new ways and new mechanisms. It's also, obviously the idea of representation is also tied strongly to modernity and to the idea that something can be simplified and universalized and then represented. The question is if this is possible. I don't think that representation is possible in this way or in this sense, like as a package. And even less by parties. I mean, it's very interesting if we look at the origins of party analysis. And parties are usually have a deeply anti-democratic functioning, and at the same time we expect them to be the core of liberal democracy. So we can see how these movements all over the world practice different forms of democracy, like direct democracy. We can call it direct participatory democracy. Sometimes it's called radical democracy or whatever. But the core of it is that there is an equality among the participants. There is a direct participation and direct decisions. So, and I think that these forms that are practiced, it's also in most of these movements, it's also not a majority democracy where the majority wins everything, but people try to get some kind of consensus, of some kind of agreement. Consensus doesn't have to mean always that 100% agree or whatever, but they try to have a result that does not exclude the ones that had a different option at the beginning. So it's not about a fight that has winners and losers like liberal democracy works, but it's about something, a way of democracy where democracy is not a result but a process. And I think that's the main difference of understanding between liberal democracy, where democracy is seen as a result, and democracy how it's practiced by the different movements, where democracy is clearly a process and not just a result.
Okay, and all of these, we're touching on so many things, and we don't have the time to go into them in detail, so really in the discussion, we should delve into whatever part of any of this you want to. And on the democracy, just kind of as a footnote as far as direct democracy, participatory democracy, there is, like with all of these things, quite a long history of other movements practicing these forms, other people theorizing about them. Again, our argument is kind of these things all taken together. But what I'm going to talk about is kind of going from the democracy then, that's part of explaining why, I know at least in Occupy in the United States, but in other movements, again and again, theorists, the media, mainstream media, but media in general, would say to us, well, so why don't you have demands? And it was said as a kind of accusation. And it's exactly because the point of reference of the movements isn't those with forms of institutional power. So it's not about asking representational democracy to be more democratic. It's creating the alternative. So not, rather than demanding, and I'll give a few examples, for example, housing, people are making sure people aren't getting evicted using forms of direct action. And a framework that someone we know, we interviewed actually, Gopal in Berkeley, California, who was with the group Occupy Farms. They were taking over land to then use for farming and doing that collectively. Used the framework of goals without demands. So thinking about the fact, of course there are goals, but how you achieve them isn't necessarily through the framework of demands. So instead looking to one another. So what that looks like is generally with forms of direct action, and a few examples. One is housing. This is one of the largest movements now, and in the beginning also was the anti-foreclosure movement in Spain and the US in particular, where the way people organize is rather than going to the bank or the city, depending where they are, and saying, please don't evict us or please don't foreclose on us, which had been tried actually in the past and was not successful. People are organizing with their neighbors, creating assemblies in this horizontal way, and actually physically preventing evictions of homes. So using their bodies to prevent evictions. Or in New York, some of the things we were doing in the anti-foreclosure movement was houses are auctioned off in courthouses, and it's a public auction. But you have to hear the auction, obviously. So people would go in and as a form of civil disobedience would sing while the auction was taking place. And it was disruptive enough that the auction wouldn't take place, and because of the backlog and the bureaucracy, it could then be months and months and months before they were again put on the list to be foreclosed on. These aren't ultimate solutions by any means, but at least it's kind of giving more time as the movement's organizing, and it's keeping families housed, which is huge. Now, in some cases, there are then relationships to institutional power, but it doesn't come out as the demand. So then maybe later the bank comes and says, we will negotiate. Hundreds of thousands of mortgages have been renegotiated in the United States after 2011, which I think is not a coincidence. And people do interact in those negotiations and empower one another, do popular education to make it happen. But it comes out of first the action. In Greece, there are two areas where this idea of goals without demands have been taking place. One is healthcare. I imagine people know that more than 2 years ago now, it used to be that healthcare was free in Greece, and now you have to pay €5 just to first go in at all and see a doctor. And then if you have to see a specialist and everything else, it can be more money. And this is a huge amount of money considering the depth of the crisis. So what people in a lot of the neighborhood assemblies have been doing is, and sometimes it's not even neighborhood assembly, sometimes it's just neighbors and people in different communities coming together. But they organize, talk to some of the doctors in the hospitals and the clinics, and the nurses and the different staff, and they go in and they occupy the cashiers. So where normally you would have to go in and pay your €5, and then you get the piece of paper that says you've paid, now you can see a doctor, you take the paper to the doctor. They occupy the cashier, sometimes put the name, the Neighborhood Assembly of Peristeri or Zografo, is now the one signing your piece of paper that you then take to the doctor, who's already been in dialogue with people in the movements and of course wants to treat people, and then treats them free. Something similar, though different, has been taking place with electricity. And if people know that there was a tax that was imposed on people's electric bills based on the square meters of your home. But if you didn't pay the tax, your electricity was cut, which can then also mean heat and everything else, hot water. And so people organized on all different kinds of levels so that this wouldn't take place, including if you got to the point where your electricity was going to be cut off, people in the neighborhoods would kind of sound an alarm, which could be like doing this kind of thing from your balcony or making noise so people knew that they were coming down the street, and people would go out and chase them out of the neighborhood. And sometimes maybe people think about Greece and you think, oh, black bloc, fighting with police. No, we're talking about, elderly women running down the street with brooms chasing, people so they won't cut off their neighbor's electricity. If it gets to the point where electricity is cut off, then people are reconnecting it. So these are these forms of direct action, not saying to the city or the state or the electric company, oh, please don't cut us off, because one, it doesn't work, and two, that's not their political point of reference, but actually doing it themselves. And these taken together, perhaps didn't start out as a different concept of power and autonomy. Over time, as people are practicing it, does become a different way of thinking about power, where power is, and creating in a way that is more autonomous rather than looking to institutional power. Yeah.
Can I give you 5 minutes more?
Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly, I think,
That's
where
fine.
we are.
So what else do these mobilizations have in common, and where are they gone? Are they really gone away after, if you look at the media, the media captures them when they are in the plaza, and then all the media say, well, the movement is dead, or they didn't even talk anymore about it. Many times for good reasons, because most of the countries where the medias are owned by big corporations, and these corporations have no interest in spreading examples over the world. So we can also see, for example, I don't know how it was here, but for example, in Italy and Germany, all the media insisted all the time about Spain that it was a youth movement. I mean, it never was a youth movement. It was people from all ages, but the representation in the German and Italian media was oh, it's a students or youth movement, always trying to discredit these movements. But one thing that we can see that all have in common is this square thing. Why this square thing? Well, first of all, because there is no clarity. I mean, we're not anymore in this representational era where there is one party or the union or whatever saying what to do and everybody does it, and we're waiting for the solution that they proposed or for the next elections. People don't know. They know they don't want what exists, but they're not sure about what or how to get to what they want. What I find very understandable, and not only understandable, I mean, I'm much more scared if someone tells me he knows exactly how everything will be done and how we get somewhere. That scares me much more than people tell me, well, we have to discuss it. We don't really know how to get to what we want. So, one change to neoliberalism is that collective spaces have disappeared. Like public spaces, public accessible spaces where you don't have to pay or consume are restricted or almost disappeared. And at the same time, the restructuring of labor has also disappeared. The workplace as congregation of equals. Like while 20 years or 30 years ago, a classical workplace, a factory, was a place where 8,000 people would come together that would have more or less the same conditions, same contract and everything. Today, the factory doesn't have 8,000 workers anymore, but 2,000, and they probably have 120 different forms of contracts in this factory, so that they're not equal. So also work from being something that has a homogenizing function is now something that is a dispersing function. So we don't have the public space anymore where people can gather and without consumption and have a certain collectivity, and the workplace isn't that anymore. So there is a need. That's why the plazas were occupied all over, because there is obviously a need for a space where to gather and to talk in a way, in an equal way, a horizontal way, and to talk about the alternatives and the ways of the alternatives. I think that's a general need all over the world, responding to a general development of neoliberal capitalism. At the same time, it's obvious you cannot change the world on the plaza, on the square. If you stay there, you won't change it. It becomes an in-group. After a while, less and less people are interested, etc., etc. So we see that also all these movements got to a certain point where they spread again in the different working areas, in the neighborhoods. That happened be it in London, be it in Occupy, be it in Plaza del Sol or whatever in Spain. It happened all over. It happened in Egypt. It happened in Greece. In some places where people had more prior political experience, it happened faster. Like in Greece, I think after a week or two, they decided, okay, let's do neighborhood assemblies, and they started on the syntagma, like to look who's from which neighborhood. It took more time in Spain, but we could see this all over how it happened. And this was also a starting point or a strengthening point for a lot of movements, some pre-existing and some that were created new from that moment. Like talked about the neighborhood assemblies that popped up in a lot of places all over the world. In Spain, we have a lot of new movements that came up, the so-called mareas, the tides, like the white tide that was a hospital sanitary movement, the green tide, the teachers, now we have the purple tide, the feminist and women rights movements that were called tides. But the interesting thing about it is that I think it's the first protest cycle where let's say the non-prior organized forms are a majority. Like while in other prior mobilizations, they were either started by traditional organized forces like unions or whatever, or at least they were an important factor or the main factor after a short while. This time, in many cases, if they joined the protests, they joined them like half a year or a year later, after they started already totally independent from traditional political organizations, be it parties, unions, etc. And they took the forms of these mobilizations. So the green tide or the white tide or even the purple tide, let's take the green tide teachers, they were unionized, but they did not work in this whole movement like their whole union structure used to be and how they used to work, but they adopted the mechanisms of assembly, of horizontalism, connections, of direct action, etc., that were set as example by the M15 movements before. Housing, like the movements against foreclosure, is also something we can observe all over. It's very strong in Spain. The Plataforma de los Afectados por la Hipoteca has now, I think, some 130, 150 chapters all over the country. And their first step was to prevent evictions. Now they're even taking over occupying buildings for people and for families. We have it in the US on a very big scale. But even like in Germany, for example, it's one of the movements that, even if there wasn't any strong movement like in the other countries, but it's one of the movements that started and have some effect also in Germany in different cities. And like it is a last example, and then I finish, is how it influenced other movements and forms of protest and organization is we have now in Europe and the Mediterranean basin, I like very much the concept of huge parts of the Italian and Spanish left to think not about Europe, but to think also about the Mediterranean basin as part of a certain political, geographical, cultural context. So to take North Africa as part of what is part of our political and cultural area. And if we take that, we have several recuperated, occupied factories that are workers controlled. That's something we haven't seen, and you haven't seen it since 1956, I think. And but also in the rest of Europe, that didn't happen since the 70s, probably, at least. And now we have like at least 2 workers controlled factories in France, one in Marseille, former Lipton tea factory that was occupied by the workers, and it is doing test production under workers' control. They're fighting with Unilever, who is the owner of the factory, to take over the factory. And I mean, they have it, but to have it legally and to produce. Ice cream factory Pilpa also in France. In southern France also, they're producing ice cream and yogurt. They started production under workers' control. We have 2 factories in Italy, one in Rome and one in Milan. There are first one and now a second factory in Turkey, in Istanbul. There is Greece, Viome in Greece, that is producing since February last year. And it's interesting how all these factories are, the movements, apart from being new, this thing that factories are occupied and then worked under workers' control, because like the most extreme thing at the beginning of the crisis was that you had workers' movements occupying factories, but just as a measure of pressure, not to take them over and produce themselves. But that's now happening, what was like the Latin American example. I mean, and it's interesting, most of them have contacts with Argentina and with workers there. Actually, Marina raised money and brought at the beginning a worker from Sanon in Argentina to Greece so that the workers could talk with them about their experience, and then after that they occupied the factory and took it over. But we have all these factories are connected to the movements. They have a direct relation to the movements that came up during these years. And also interesting is that almost all of these factories changed their production to more ecological production. Like Viome was producing chemically produced construction material and is now doing organic cleaning products. The tea factory, Fralip, in close to Marseille, was doing industrial Lipton tea. Their project now is to produce organic linen tea regionally, etc. The ice cream and yogurt factory, same thing. They are also producing now organic ice cream and yogurt with regional products and distributing regionally. So we see that that has been the case in a lot of, like the two factories in Italy, for example, had to change completely because they could not go on producing what they produce, and both have huge industrial recycling projects. So we see that how this consciousness of ecology and of the problems that the society has is deeply rooted in the workers, and when they have the chance to choose what to do, they choose that. Maybe not only because they think of the better world, but it's also because they think of their own health. And it's obviously much more healthy for them to work these things and produce these things than the things they produced before. But that's just a short, and I think we can talk more about all these different points during the discussion. Thanks.
So what I'm going to do, I'm going to throw a couple of questions to them. And I give them, I think, not more than 3 minutes each to respond punctually to them. Right? They can say it's nonsense, or they can give a more constructive answer. That is up to them. And from that moment on, the floor is open. Now let me first, before I'm painted as an old conservative, let me first establish my credentials here. My father was the director of a cooperative factory, and I was a squatter, while he was the director of a cooperative factory. So that is probably, when I'm a left-wing anthropologist, I would even say a Marxian anthropologist. So that is altogether something, right? So don't push me in the wrong hole. Now, I very much agree that much of what we have been seeing over the last years in terms of mobilizations is only very weakly anticipated by social movement research as a professional field. And I really think that we are in a new epoch, as I think Marina started out by saying. I very much agree that that is the case. So let's say a set of key concepts within social movement research that allowed it to professionalize and to become, a great home industry within the social sciences, like mediascapes, like political opportunity structures, like resource mobilization. Much of these 3 technical key explanatory foci, factors, if you like, of social movement research can only be used in, let us say, very transformed ways in order to explain the recent mobilizations. So we are really in a different era as compared to, let us say, the 1980s, early 2000s. With the professionalization of mobilization, the construction of relatively professional social movement organizations. Much of this is happening these days without these organizations, and indeed by people, and I quote one of you, who are not previously organized. Now, having said that, I do think you have your history wrong. And it is an important point. It's not just a historical antiquarian point. You have a bit of your history wrong. So David Graeber is actually a friend of mine. And I keep telling him, forget about General Assemblies being something new. Yeah, you're right. The movements are new. Well, in the 1970s, when I was a squatter, we had, and participating in all sorts of other movements, there were always general assemblies, not with these movements, but with these movements, right? So I don't think these movements are necessarily so crucial to that. General assemblies, as a, let us say, as a sort of democratic forum, were also pretty important in the beginning of the Russian Revolution. Were important in the Paris Commune, right? So these, and you can go on and on. Were important in the revolutions directly after the First World War in Central and Western Europe. The early communist parties were very much sort of being pushed forward by general assemblies of all sorts of kinds. Now, the importance of this is that while I think we are facing something new, I don't think we are facing something new in terms of organization. Yes, we are facing a new epoch in terms of organization as compared to an earlier epoch. That earlier epoch started in the 1980s, basically in Europe and in the US. Basically with the professionalization of social movement organizations and turning them into NGOs to a large extent. Or in any case, the professionalization of the whole sector. Right? But the 1970s were and the late 1960s were absolutely a period where, let's say, horizontalism and anarchist forms of mobilization were completely prevalent. And I still wonder whether the numbers are larger now than then. I'm not sure. In any case, for the countries that I know very well, that is not the case in Northwestern Europe. In Germany and the Netherlands, you could have massive groups of people on the street without much organizing. I remember demonstrations of 150, 200,000 people that were just hardly organized in advance. Right? So I'm simply not sure about the time of year, and that's, I don't think, incidental. But there is a very important theoretical issue here. This is a political economy research group, and I think it should be mentioned. I hear you talk very little about capitalism and class. And I hear you very little embedding your political critique of neoliberalism, of the nation state as the focus of politics, in a critique of capitalism. Now, if you look at the whole literature at the moment that sort of tries to track and analyze the mobilizations that we've been seeing and we will be seeing, then of course there is a great coming together in all sorts of particular ways of two very important analytical and critical streams, and populist streams. And that is the coming together again, since about a century, a little bit more than a century, of anarchism and Marxism. Anarchism, of course, represented by the critique on liberal democracy and on hierarchical political forms. Marxism, probably being stronger in its analysis of neoliberalism and having a much more anti-capitalist critique. But the two link up in all sorts of ways. When you look at the recent books of Harvey, for example, and the recent books of David Graeber, then you see all sorts of points of connections that have not been there for a very, very long time, basically since the blow-up between Marx and Bakunin in 1872. Right? So that is very interesting, which again indicates that we are indeed, as you say, in a new epoch. But then I think slightly more complexly situated than the two of you tend to do. I see you very much in, let us say, the anarcho streak of this, but I don't see you making a lot of gestures toward the Marxists. And I would like to press you a little bit on that. Now, why the hell is liberal democracy not allowing us much space anymore for reform? That is the big question here. Is that because representative systems have become closed off? Are there no political opportunities anymore? Do we sort of need to radicalize the democratization critique of political parties and bureaucracy and parliamentary democracy? Or is the nation state form itself, as the instantiation of politics within a globalized capitalism, increasingly defunct and unable to deliver the goods? If that is so, we need a little bit more of a Marxian critique. If you agree with the first version, we need even more of the anarchism. So this is the button I'd like to push, and I give both of you 3-4 minutes to respond spontaneously, and the floor is open.
Okay, I'm going to touch more on, actually, I think some of the newness question, and a little on the other. I agree with the anarchism and Marxism coming together. At least when I was speaking more in relating what people in the movements are doing and say they're doing, and less trying to then theorize. So while I think the movements are anti-capitalist, many people, at least when the movements first begin in that first year, don't necessarily identify as anti-capitalist. Over time, that might happen. So this is where it gets tricky. Is it anarchist? The forms look like anarchism, but people don't identify as anarchist, nor do they identify as Marxist. But if it's anti-capitalist and has a critique of capitalism, it raises all of these questions. So I'm speaking a lot from the point of what people in the movements say they're doing. As far as the end, if it's okay with you, I'm going to give you the capitalism, Marxism question. because I want to talk a little bit more on the newness, because I think it is really important. I don't think any of these things in and of themselves are new, and it's really important to say that. Horizontal processes and assembly processes have been, go back, I don't know, depends how long you want to go back and think about direct democracy. Not that, in ancient Greece, women were allowed to participate, or slaves, or, the majority of society, but the concepts of direct democracy go back. And it does a disservice to feminist practice to not ground these movements in what women have worked on all over the world in creating more horizontal processes. Direct action, though, we can then, all of these things could be kind of mapped in and have a lineage in wonderful movements throughout history. What is new now is that we take all of these different pieces, the idea of goals without demands, and you could look at whether in the US that's the Wobblies. There's so many different movements who've organized in this way. But then you put that together with the horizontal processes, you put that together with the use of space to create something new, with the concepts of prefiguration, creating the new in the old. So many of these things all are grounded in different movements, but when you start to put them all together, and then people coming together in big squares, and then moving from the big assemblies, feeling that confidence, feeling like an agent in their life, or a political person finally, and then moving that into neighborhoods or workplaces, kind of re-territorializing, as Dario was talking about. That also, all these things put together and then being so consistent is what I think makes them new. And the numbers of people, and it continues. We'll have conversations and people say, okay, well, that was then. And then Bosnia happens. And not having yet, I was there in the past, I haven't been recently, but in talking to people and in looking at the assemblies and the ways in which they're organizing, it seems very consistent with what's been going on around the world. Brazil, absolutely the same summer as Turkey. And now Brazil has, I don't know how many, dozens and dozens of assemblies throughout the country, organizing these horizontal assemblies in different locations. So that is what I think makes it new. Not without precedent, but put all together, I think it's exciting how different it is. I would talk more about the contentious politics framework that you're, but because of time, I won't really, but and I've done it in one of my books, so yeah.
Very good. Okay, come back to it later.
Yeah.
So the capitalism, Marxism,
Now you
and
get
history,
capitalism.
but keep it short.
I try to keep it
Right.
as short as the 3 volumes of Capital. Well, first of all, I think that it's obviously a very central question, and also I think that I'm still convinced that without a Marxist critique, you cannot understand how capitalism works. The question is how we. At the same time, there are several questions, obviously, that have to be rediscussed and renewed. Because if we take the traditional, be it Marx or be it Rosa Luxemburg, about workers' control, for example, it would be rejected. And that's, for example, Greece. In Greece, you have the Greek Communist Party that is against the factory because it's, if it's workers' controlled, you cannot build a union to fight the bosses. So it's so obviously there are some concepts that have to be renewed. But I think that Marxism is, in Marxist analysis, and Marxism is not only important, but it's also absolutely back. If we look all around Wall Street, the bookstores, what they sold most is Marx. Handelsblatt, that's the daily newspaper for business people and financial world in Germany. The readers actually elected 2 years ago Marx as the most important economist of all times. It's obviously a capitalist newspaper. So, and the central explanation for it was it's the only classic that has not been, proved wrong up to now. So I think that's important. What I think is a new quality in all that is that this, even if you had these assemblies or these things, you usually had them for a very short time. Then usually they turned into party forms, traditional forms that take over or were crushed by party apparatus, etc. And I think that this time it's like the first time that even when the huge movement is coming to an visible end, because it goes into the neighborhoods and factories and workplaces and whatever, but it's not the moment that traditional politics comes back, but it stays in this, let's say, new form. That's what I think it's the new quality. And it's also always like this mix of all these elements, because many of them elements, and we write that in book, going back to obviously, but having been always like the heretics of communism, be it the council communists or being whatever that, but at the same time I think yes that they have an important role in nowadays. And it's also, if we look what is republished right now, we will see like that Panekirk is republished all over, for example, in German, in Spanish, in whatever, like all these council communist stuff and other things. So I think it's
about workers' control and workers'
the whole workers' control question that comes up again and all over the world. So I think that these questions are absolutely central, and that the critique of democracy, I wouldn't say it's only of liberal democracy. It's anarchist, or it's only anarchist or more anarchist. I mean, I would say it's even it's also a Marxist critique. I mean, without a doubt. And being here, I mean, one of now I remember something about Otto Bauer, for example, when he talked about representative democracy as being a tool in the hands of the rich, the bosses, and the priests, as like conditioning the people, for example.
Can I push you a bit more on one issue? Then the floor is entirely open, I think. But do respond very curtly.
Yes.
Rudely. So, you talk a lot about pushing politics into the neighborhoods and the factories and the fields, which is a very nice picture to paint, and I very much agree with it, also as an anthropologist and as a dreamer. How much internationalism do we need to?
How much? Absolutely. I mean, we have to, and I think we're seeing it. That's something, whether it's actual individuals who know each other, from the movements, or just movements exchanging experiences. And I do think, while it is not a technological revolution, a Facebook revolution, or any of that nonsense, that has been very helpful in it becoming more international and people supporting each other. So you have global protests in solidarity with others when there's certain repression or something like that. But also the sharing, the example of the workplaces. There was just this gathering of the recuperated workplaces in Europe, and that was huge, where people could share experiences from Greece and France and Italy, having had them from Argentina. So it is necessary, and it's happening. It could happen more, it could happen better, it could happen more democratically, in the sense of who participates and what have you. But yeah.
Okay. Sure.
What I missed from the presentation is the comparative aspect. So you talk about a lot of things, and but I think to assess the actual effect or the actual importance of this movement, you need to ask the question compared to what, and especially compared to each other. So I think your research might benefit from picking a framework in which you can actually compare these movements. You have some historically comparative perspective, but how do these movements compare to each other? Because I'm sure that they are not the same. And by teasing out the differences and kind of highlighting more the differences, we could maybe gain even more insights into this movement. And about the historical aspects, so if I understood it correctly, you claim that traditional representative politics, so these movements are against traditional representative politics, and the motivation of the people who participate in them is to overcome the traditional forms of representation. But I think there is a crucial difference whether they participate because they reject the idea of representative democracy, or do they participate simply because the traditional organizations doesn't deliver the goods. Because I think it's a big difference, and I think for most people the motivation is not that they have a theoretical problem with representative organizations, but because they clearly don't deliver the goods. And just compare, again, bringing in the historical perspective a little bit better, I think if you talk about the concessions which capitalism gave, I think it's important to emphasize that the only kind of movement which managed to reach these concessions was social democracy, which relied on huge mobilizing or hierarchical structures. So again, I think you should choose if you want to achieve some concessions, or you stay at the horizontal level, but you won't achieve anything. I mean, it's a little bit too.
Okay, well, that's a very provocative point. Can I just ask who else is at this point burning with the question? Then I think we take two, and you can just choose how and who responds, please.
It connects a bit to the last part, because I'm really very much in favor of this horizontal movement, but I'm sometimes a bit skeptic about the actual contention that they pose, because especially with the Occupy movement, in many aspects, Occupy has a people's library. When cities start having those bookshelves where everyone can put their old books and people can take books. Occupy has assemblies, so I don't know, some local communities also start having the assemblies which aren't horizontal anymore, but still the assemblies, so many people see them as the same thing. So what I'm wondering is how much of this is really, how much of this is actually just going to be integrated into conventional politics, and how much of this is really a contention, and how much stays at this, it's a nice experiment. I can go there after work, meet new people, have a nice evening, and a few weeks later we start on this path.
Okay, so how effective and how durable is this all?
These are great questions and huge, so please don't be offended if we only touch on some parts of them. The comparative thing is great. As you were speaking, I was like, another book. Having people in dialogue from the different movements where we help facilitate with questions. Because we just had a friend visit from Occupy in Berlin, and she kept saying, oh, and we do this in, we're doing this in New York with housing, and you're doing this in Berlin, and learning from one another in that way. So I think that's a really great thing. As far as it is a danger. The danger of, okay, we have nice assemblies and we feel good about it. In some places, sometimes. I think it depends on the level of crisis as well. So that's okay, except if you're facing foreclosure, you're not in that situation of, okay, it just feels okay. Or in Greece, pretty uniformly, it no longer is an option. So people continue in that way, continue organizing in horizontal ways. It's also, I think, looking at this over time. So not being pessimistic at all, but that this isn't, this is the first very, very early stages, what we're seeing in the last few years, of a new way of doing politics in all of these forms that are consistent, taken together, and that will continue. So we're seeing the very beginning of, I think, something that will be completely different and transformative, and hopefully absolutely not get co-opted, if they even can. I mean, if social democracy has the capacity is, I think, even a question as far as financially. But continuing in the direction of taking over workplaces and beginning to actually think about how to run your community and your life is the bigger questions, and creating something altogether new, a whole new form of governance with a whole new kind of system. So again, while things didn't ideologically start with a rejection of representation or a rejection of capitalism, in movements that have existed over time in assemblies where they continue and people continue a dialogue, people are coming to those conclusions. So I think that is really important. The theoretical part of how people are reflecting on what they're doing is really important, not just what it means.
About that, well, I think the problem about social democracy is not even if one likes it or not, or if one thinks that the goals are fine or not. I think that, like I said before, the space for concessions is not there anymore. So also social democracy didn't achieve anything during the last 20 years. It's just, You know, while before you could say like social democracy as party or as unions, they got at least every year, like you got a raise in your salary that corresponds a bit more than an inflation rate. Now it's always under the inflation rate, and they do some additional cuts. So it's so I think it's not even that we have the option like like in revolution or reform, because the reform option does not exist anymore. There is no space for the reform. That does not mean automatically that we will have revolution or radical change or whatever. That's
do you agree with that?
obviously
That there is no space for reform anymore.
Well, again, I think it depends comparatively. Like in some places, not necessarily social democracy, but mainstream kind of centrist parties have at least managed to maintain social spending. Like they across the board, maybe it's true, but again, comparatively, Scandinavians are still doing a good job. And Northern Europe or in general, it's not. So especially in the center, these tensions are not working out so well as you probably think.
Well, I would argue that in Scandinavia, the only country that maintained is Norway, but not because of social democracy, but because of oil. I think that if we go to the and that's why if we talk about the question of integration or co-optation, I think that is also not that much an option anymore, because there is nothing to co-opt movements with. I mean, they don't have any more much to offer. I mean, apart from that, you might be co-opted in and integrated into whatever bureaucratic rituals and institutional rituals and all that. I agree. But it has been always the problem of every movement and of every left, that either you win or you contribute to modernized capitalism. I mean, that has been like that during the last 150 years. So,
on that, can I just say something? I completely forgot it when you were asking the question on what's used or taken from the movement or co-opted. Co-opted wouldn't even be the right word, but Homeland Security came out with a report on after Hurricane Sandy in New York, and how people from Occupy organized tens of thousands of volunteers and millions of dollars in aid and rebuilding houses and everything. So horizontally organized relief efforts. So there's this report that just came out, and it uses the word horizontal 8 times. I was just sent questions because someone's writing an article about it, and they use the passages where they use horizontal, and they're arguing that perhaps organizing in a horizontal way is better. And not, disaster theorists in sociology have argued this for a long time, but they're using the language of the movement, Homeland Security, as how things could perhaps be better. So it is something to, for sure, be aware of.
But that is a larger issue there, right? I mean, the whole language of networks, right? Which, if you read Jeffrey Juris's book, which has networks in the title, and which is about anarchist global protest. If you look at the title, you could think it's about Wall Street, it's about finance, right? So to what extent is the anarchist horizontalism actually reflecting the actual workings of a network economy that is driven by finance and, let us say, creative capital? Right? So, do you take distance from that?
well, definitely. It's also a question of not only of a practice, but also of content and goals, obviously. So. Definitely, but that has happened, like I say, with everything. If we think that people that are not a family living together was absolutely subversive 30 years ago, and now it's absolutely functional to capitalism, because even lawyers cannot afford their own apartment anymore in many cities. So I think that everything is always contributing to the modernization of capitalism. That's the problem with capitalism, that it's a totality and that it's able to absorb everything. And then it's not falling on its own. Like Gramsci already said, we have to kick it. It's not dying and just leaving us alone.
So if social democracy is not working anymore, do the two of you think that we need a new communism, like Jody Dean in this little book on the Communist Horizon is arguing?
on the book itself, it makes a good, the book has a really good critique. As far as the answer, I don't agree with. I mean, she kind of, to me, falls back on more traditional forms of thinking about change as far as communism and building a certain kind of political party and forms of hierarchy and everything else. Though I like the critique in the book. I don't care if it's called communism. Sure, okay. Or anarchism. Okay, though that's less accessible. We need to get rid of capitalism and organize in a completely different way, and I think yes, so that where there's real democracy. There's so much to the history of communism and anarchism that I think it's really useful to draw on. But do we need a new communism? I think what we don't need is a new manifesto of what we need. But we need to think together about a multiplicity of ways of changing the world, and then we have to get to it, which is I think what people are actually doing. It can get more specific, and I think it will. These movements are really new, and I think theories will come out of the practice more. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Can I add just
Yes, of course.
to the thing? One thing is that so if you ask me personally, I would say yes. Okay, for me, it's I would say I'm a communist, and I would base my analysis on Marxism. But I met people in different regions and contexts of the world that would argue absolutely the same thing from an anarcho-syndicalist perspective, or maybe from Afro-Venezuelan historical experience, or from an indigenous experience. So I can have my way to get there, but it's not exclusive. So I think that's part of what is new in this epoch. How you mentioned, it's not only anarchism and Marxism, it's also certain interpretations even of religion, for example, even if I might not agree with it, but it also in indigenous politics, or certain Caribbean, Afro-American politics, etc. So we have these different, let's say, entries to get there, and I think it's new that they started communicating with each other and not pretending to be the only available view. And
sorry, I'm just looking at the time.
so one sentence was
Yes, one sentence.
about the comparative. What we saw, for example, in Greece and Spain, comparing it. Spain was very obvious that there was much less political experience background. So at the beginning they were very like, no, we're not left, we're not right, we're not the one, not the other, we have nothing to do with the Spanish Republic, it's we're totally new. Everybody was stressing that, and they would like talking about last week was the most most historical thing they would do to identify the movement. And in Greece you would talk to them and they would start talking about 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, and like have this historical frame that would be like totally different. After a few years now we can see loads of Spanish Republic flags in every demonstration in Spain, because the movement obviously evolved and found these historical roots that it didn't see before, for example. So I think it's also a question of time and change.
But I have one with respect to actually the discussion in terms of the relationship between anarchism and Marxism, and the importance of the Marxist critique, and to what extent it enters the social literature or not. One issue that at the very start you mentioned, and that sort of brought back the issue of class and class composition, and I was wondering what your experience as both activists as well as scholars in terms of being, both within those movements in different countries, and you sort of identified it as middle class mobilization in a lot of the countries. I mean, I have issue with this notion of middle class. I mean, is that what you, how you sort of pick it up on, in the sense that, the whole debate of middle class is huge, obviously, and to what extent it is explanatory enough, to what extent it's actually depoliticizing, and to what extent actually the people that we identify as members of the middle class today are perhaps, actually, workers in a different form, or sort of a different form of emerging working class, if you like. So that's one thing. I don't want to go so much in detail, turning it into a big comment. That is one thing, and the other is, actually it's been touched upon, but it is sort of about, again, it's linked to these points, and it's sort of more about, I think, I know these are not easy questions, but sort of what comes afterwards, and in terms of organization afterwards. I mean, I have been in Istanbul, in Taksim, throughout the June uprising, and I've experienced it, obviously within a certain angle, and then I've had my own perhaps relatively narrow personal experience, so I was not entirely aware of it in all aspects, but still from my limited experience and from what has come afterwards in Turkey, it seems that it is important to think about and perhaps remember, the sort of the phrase of either barbarianism or socialism, in the sense that what happens in Turkey at the moment is a form of barbarism, in the sense that we are experiencing this huge corruption scandal and an amazingly rapidly authoritarian government that is getting more and more authoritarian every single day. And it is sort of, I think it's safe enough to call it fascism. It's not. I think it would not be sort of a foreign regime. So in that sense, from all these analyses of and from all this sort of embrace of social movements that has happened since 2011, what have been their legacy? I know they're continuing. It's sort of we should not expect perhaps sort of easy one-off solutions, but at the same time, what we identify, capitalism does not stand, and wait for us to sort of continue to organize and somehow crash it. It also moves, and it is getting more and more brutal. So, what are your views on that?
Okay, very good. There's one more question. We take two, and then we can sort of round off. Please.
All right. Discuss about the opposite side, where on one side the crisis, and I think people have chosen to these popular movements. On the other side, you've seen the rise of far right parties. Secondly, it seems to me that people can still have quite a nice life within liberal democracies, certain places, and it's proven because there's people leaving half of Eastern Europe and going there to certain places. And finally, do you think liberal democracy is not working? Maybe a different size, so breaking up countries, seeing like the UK, Scotland wants to leave. I couldn't understand why. But maybe even within countries like the UK, maybe plenty of people would be happy with a northern region, which is not so dependent on London. So that's three points.
And there's such great questions, we can't do them justice in a few minutes. But so the one on class, I think I was being really flip in saying middle class. I don't mean it. The media refers to it that way. A lot of people refer to themselves that way, and I think I fall into saying middle class, and it's kind of an offhand. And no, though a lot of people probably would have identified as middle class, even if they were working in a pizza shop, but because they went to university and had aspirations of a kind of life and a kind of status. I still agree that that's actually working class, but that's my analysis, not others. Something that's interesting that happened in the United States, though, and in different periods of my life, I've organized in different ways, including as a union organizer at certain times. As faulty as the union structure is, we need unions. But class consciousness is not something we've had in the United States at all. And since Occupy, while not explicitly on class, the whole concept of 99% really has brought that in the most positive sense of class consciousness. It started out, with the Tumblr, the 99%. Oh, I'm in the 99% because I owe all of this money, or because I'm losing my house, or I have, credit card debt and student loan debt. And it shifted really quickly from being it's so terrible I'm in the 99% to, we are the 99% as this strong affirmation and, kind of screw you who has power, who's hurting us. And that kind of class consciousness is incredibly powerful, and I think that's part of what leads to then some of the recuperations we're seeing, is that, yes, we're being hurt, we're clear where it's coming from, we are the majority, we're not afraid anymore. I mean, there's the whole culture of shame in the United States, well, in a lot of places around the world, if you're going to lose your home, the amount of debt you have. And so the movements have kind of taken on these questions in a way where there are assemblies where you share what your debt is and you burn your paper that says how much you owe and things. And it's actually really empowering. I have a huge amount of debt from all of the school I've gone to. And it's empowering to say it out loud. I wouldn't have said it out loud before. And that then links to this other question, because I can't get to all of it, but the question of kind of, well, then the longevity and what next. And the sense of urgency, I feel you, yes. It's moving slower than I think most people would want, but that change in how we feel in being the 99% and feeling dignity is something that in Spain they've been referring to as the DNA of the 15M. So the movement, the 15M, the DNA that then infuses itself in ways people are organizing and how people feel about themselves. And so that, in Turkey, there's this moment right now that's really horrible, but underneath it, there is so much that has come out of the movements that I think we will continue to see.
Yeah, about the question of change, transformation, etc. I don't know if it was Origi or Wallerstein that one of the system theorists that said that the two revolutions that changed most in the world were the ones that were not successful, like 1848 and 1968. They changed more than any other revolution. So
they co-authored the book.
So they co-authored it? Okay. So I think we cannot say now what will be the outcome or how much did it really move what happened. But I think if I look at one thing, and that's also one huge difference to the 60s and 70s, even if maybe in the 60s and 70s, even if mobilizations were maybe in some parts stronger or had more persistence or whatever, and seemed to be more bigger mass of people that was against the system. But at the same time, we look at I think that the system was much more stable and consolidated in those times. If we look at polls, for example, you had this 30% maybe that were protesting or whatever, but you had 70% or 80% of the people that would answer and say, the politicians are trying to do good for the people in the country. The courts are doing justice. The police is maintaining order. You ask the same questions now, even in Western Europe and Germany. I mean, in Spain, 95% of the people say politicians are corrupt and look only at their own good. No one believes anymore that parties are really working for the people. I mean, so can we, as left, fill this gap? That's the question, because obviously I don't say it's automatically a positive, or I think even we have a very short window of time until even in all liberal democracies, authoritarian systems will come in, and they're already coming in. If we look at Greece, for example, or if we look at Spain, where, you can be fined now 16,000 euros if you demonstrate near the parliament, because it's forbidden. They passed
forbidden in Turkey.
Yeah, they passed a law in Spain where it's now forbidden for media to print pictures of people that are beaten up by the police. I mean, these are all things or if we look at the different security and terrorism laws that have been passed during the last years in the different countries, we will notice that it's not about bombs, it's about blocking streets, about blocking railway tracks and things like that. So we're going, I think, in very big steps towards authoritarian regimes all over. And
can I pick this up with the question that you posed? And I want you to actually reflect on that question. So what about the new right? Right? If this is happening, if this securitization politics will be magnified over time, then it is certainly the new right that's going to drive it in alliance with what used to be the Social Democrats and the New Liberals. Now, the new right has one enormous advantage over our new left, and that it actually believes in the state and in hierarchy. Would you respond to that question of his about the new right? What about the new right?
I'm feeling the active.
Well, I think it's obviously in different situations now. It's very functional for the system in a sense that they can argue a lot of laws about immigration, about security, etc. The whole security discourse always but if we don't do that, the right will be even stronger or whatever. I think it's in Europe and Latin America, it has been like that the last hundreds of years, that you always have this confrontation between an extreme right and the left, in leftist forces especially around times of crisis, be it economic, political crisis, or social crisis, or whatever. I think it's, but I think that that the extreme right, like as kind of historical fascism, is not an option. Is not an option because it's actually not an option for a globalized capital to have this restricted, racist, xenophobic, whatever vision of a classical fascism, of an authoritarianism that we might redefining what fascism is. If fascism is not only a historical category but has some sense today, we have to redefine it. Then we can talk about it if these authoritarian systems that are coming are really a threat, are they fascist or not. But I think if we look at the parties, I think what has definitely is danger, even bigger danger than like, I don't think, for example, Golden Dawn is, yeah, I mean, they're ugly and whatever you want, but I don't think that they are really a political threat. A political threat is the reformed ultra right-wing fascism in Italy, or the Lega Nord, or the new option of the English Defense League, for example, that is suddenly anti-Muslim, pro-Israel, pro-Jewish, etc., pro-capital, for example, and picks up these different elements that work together. Or someone who, like in the Netherlands, for example, Wilders. They are much more dangerous than this idiot fascist right, because they represent a political option in a modern globalized capital, what the others don't.
The interesting thing, of course, and then we're going to close because we're over time already. The interesting thing with the new left and the new right might be that ultimately the new right keeps believing in the state as a system, but is increasingly skeptical about globalized capital, whereas the new left keeps believing in cosmopolitanism and globalization, all the globalism, and doesn't believe in the state, but may actually fail to compete with the new right in terms of its practical anti-capitalist critique. And I'm not saying that ultimately the new right is anti-capitalist. We know that the new right will never be anti-capitalist, but here in Hungary we know, and in the Netherlands we know, and in many other places we know, Ukraine, that the new right is effectively, rhetorically anti-capitalist, national socialist. And I think this competition will sort of paint the scene for the next 10 years.
So we have to out-organize them, that's all.
Yep.
We will. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.